Welcome, everyone, to this briefing brought to you by IDSF, the Israel Defense and Security Forum. In Hebrew, our name is Abitronistim. There is a lot happening in this war in Israel. We're going to jump right in. We're going to begin with Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsh, who is the former military prosecutor for Judea and Samaria and the director for the Initiative for the Palestinian Authority Accountability and Reform. And then towards the end of our briefing, we're going to get a field report from Gaza, what's going on there by Brigadier General Amir Avivi. So Maurice, thank you so much for joining me today.
Moshe, thanks for having me again.
So let's start. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what's happening in Gaza right now.
Okay, so what we're seeing in Gaza at the moment, at least I'll give you a brief summary of what happened until 2 days ago. And from then we can move on to the last couple of days and those events. At the start of the war, 215 days ago, we saw intensive IDF activities all through the northern area of the Gaza Strip. For 3-4 months almost, Israel concentrated only on the northern Gaza Strip, going into Gaza City, going into Sajidiyah, going into that entire area and trying to clean it out of as many of the Hamas fighting units as were possible. It brought us to the start of Ramadan about 2 months ago, when by then everything of the north had to a great extent been taken care of. That's a very broad term. There is still not a small amount of Hamas activity. There are not a small amount of Hamas terrorists. But as a general rule, Israel was more in control of the northern area. What we were left with were 2 of the refugee camps in the south and Rafah. Rafah is the southern city of the Gaza Strip, borders on with Egypt, and really those were the strongholds of what was left of Hamas. Israel, at least our intelligence said that at the start of the war, Hamas had 24 different battalions. By the end of that first 3.5-4 months, we got down to 4 battalions left. We destroyed many of their fighting forces, and those fighting forces were now concentrated in the southern area. Then it came Ramadan, and everything seemed to stop. Israel's forces predominantly pulled out, and we seemed to stop in the same place. We weren't allowing the Gazans to go back to the northern Gaza Strip because there were still military operations going on there. There were still tunnels that were being discovered there. There were still terrorist infrastructures that needed to be dealt with. But on the other hand, we also weren't pushing forward into Deir al-Balah and Rafah and that entire southern area. And there we've been stuck. The discussion constantly was, well, how are you going to go into Rafah? Because what we'd done is we'd asked the civilian population of Gaza to move from the north down to the south, towards Rafah. And the civilians really had answered that call and had moved to the south. Now they're all in the south. We're talking about, there are different estimates of how many people there are, how many people are really in Rafah. Anything from a conservative estimate of about 1 million people in that general area, going up to a higher number as 1.8 and 1.9 million people. How do you explain a discrepancy of 1 million people? As they say in Yiddish, ich weiß. No one really knows to say how many people there were to start with, how many people there are now, and what is going to be there. So and that's where we've been. There were discussions constantly as to providing the humanitarian aid to the Gazan population on the one hand, and this constant idea of, well, possibly we can reach a political deal negotiated by the US administration together with the terror-supporting Qataris that would bring about potentially the release of some of the 132 hostages being held in Gaza, and with as little use as military force as possible. And that's where we've been really for the last 2 months, constant discussions on that subject. how can you go into Rafah without a clear plan as to how you're going to evacuate the population? And on the other hand, well, maybe we can make a deal with the terrorists and persuade them that they should give up on their strategic assets in return for some type of political deal. I say strategic assets that they see, while we see human beings as the hostages, they see the hostages as insurance policies, as strategic assets. Yahya Sinwar knows, the head of Hamas knows that once he has no more hostages, he's a dead man. And so what he's doing and what he will carry on doing is holding the hostages as his own personal insurance policy. So we've seen that playing out and then really just coming to a head in the last few days where we saw a negotiated situation where that Israel was forced, strong-armed into accepting, that said that there would be a deal of a cease in the fighting for 40 days. Israel would release X amount of prisoners, a whole scale had been set up, and in return, Hamas would release 33 live hostages. Hamas didn't accept that agreement, even though US President Biden and the State Department said that it was the best deal that Israel had ever offered. It really was a tremendous amount of concessions on Israel's side. And Hamas decided then 2 nights ago to accept its deal. But what was that? That was really an act of misinformation. It was accepting a deal that it itself had written for itself and to itself only. In its own deal, Israel would stop the fighting for 42 days and not 40 days. Hamas would decide which hostages to release, as opposed to the agreed deal of 33 live hostages. Hamas decided that it would only release 30 hostages, some live, some not alive. And they added on that they would have the veto as to which terrorists would be released by Israel. Really, so they would decide, we want Israel to release all of our strategic assets, but on the other hand, we're going to give you nothing. And at the end of the day, and this really was to complete the package, Hamas's deal said there would be a constant ceasefire, meaning that Israel would basically have to say, well, we've lost the war. We haven't managed to eradicate Hamas. We are at the same time as we are giving in and giving up on our strategic assets, we're also giving up on the hostages. Because if the deal says only 33 hostages or 30 hostages, and some of them are alive and some of them are not, Hamas could really have released 29 dead hostages and just 1 live hostage, if at all. So really, they were deciding that these terrorists were going to be holding all of the cards for themselves, and that's the agreement that they decided, that they agreed to by themselves. No one else had discussed it. No one else even knew about it. Israel certainly didn't agree to it. And so that's where we are. So yesterday morning, we saw the movement finally of IDF forces into Rafah, into that whole southern area of the Gaza Strip, taking over the Rafah crossing point. That's the official crossing point between Israel and Egypt. There is that entire, what's called the Philadelphia corridor, that area, that band or strip of land adjacent to the border between Egypt and the Gaza Strip. That's called the Philadelphia corridor. And so Israel has seized the first 6 kilometers out of 14, going from west to east and taking over the crossing. As anyone really knows, the analysts of Gaza know that the person who controls the Rafah crossing really controls the Gaza Strip, because that's the entry and exit point of these of the terrorists, with the exception, obviously, of all of the hundreds, if not thousands, of terror tunnels, smuggling tunnels that Hamas has developed over the years, going to and from Egypt. And that's really where we're standing at the moment. Israel has started its offensive on the Rafah area with the idea of getting to the Hamas leaders, Mohammed Yahya Sinwar, and rescuing the hostages. And at the same time, trying to continue on with these efforts to separate, distinguish between the civilian population. We saw just yesterday or this morning, so many days just blend into the others, one into the other, an announcement that the US had finished the construction of the floating port that they'd chosen to establish outside Gaza, which would allow the entry of greater amounts of humanitarian aid into into Gaza. We saw, on the other hand, the IDF spokesman saying these are the areas that the IDF is going to operate in. These are the areas that we recommend to you that you evacuate from, and really lines and lines and lines of people, of Gazans, listening to that call, leaving those areas, moving to the areas that's an area that's adjacent to the Mediterranean Sea called the Muwasi. That's the area where Israel has made sure that there are more field hospitals, more tents, more aids in order to facilitate that evacuation. And despite the skepticism, it would seem that the Gazan civilians are actually moving there. And they're possibly sick of being human shields for Hamas on the one hand, and having already understood the world doesn't really care about them. The Egyptians haven't agreed to receive even one Gazan refugee. They've closed the border off. They don't want to see them at all. The US appears to be condemning them with their policies to the continued dictatorial leadership of this genocidal terrorist group of Hamas, and seems to be strong-arming Israel into moving forward to conceding the battle on the one hand, stopping temporarily, albeit, the transfer of exact ammunitions. What would the US administration prefer? That we not use exact precision weapons, but rather we use bigger bombs? I can tell you, in my experience, my background, as you mentioned, is in law. The laws of war don't require Israel to use smart bombs. And if the US doesn't want to help us with smart bombs, then we're certainly entitled to use not smart bombs. And that obviously has its repercussions to date, as so many people have already said, of people who have proper, real military experience have said that Israel's measures that it's taken over the last 7 months are unprecedented in urban warfare. Never has a country done so much in order to warn and evacuate and distinguish from the fighters, the terrorists, and the civilian population. And that's something which we've managed to do over the period of time, and we've managed to keep up. And so we would like to carry on to be able to do that. But it depends obviously on the support coming in. And so you're seeing that intertwining of political considerations with military considerations, inside, outside, external pressures, Hamas, Qatar, Egypt, the US, all coming in from different sides, and not so many people being particularly supportive of Israel. Was obviously we have a lot to be thankful for from the US administration until now. Substantial support, which really we tremendously appreciate, obviously, but it seems to be that the US support is wavering and sending this very problematic message to the entire Middle East that they don't really have our back. And so when you're talking about possibly moving to the wider Middle East and looking at the wider picture of a US-Saudi deal, of a security pact, of a defense pact, well, why would the Saudis necessarily believe that there is any force behind that pact when it would seem to the Saudis that Israel is being, I shudder to say abandoned, but America doesn't necessarily unequivocally have, or the US administration doesn't unequivocally have Israel's back, which I think the American people actually do. And so that's a little bit of what's going on. There are political moves going on all around at the same time. But maybe that I can give you as an introduction.
Thank you, Maurice, for that very thorough introduction. Let me ask you this recent failure to strike a deal with Hamas reminds me of years and years and years of Israeli military leaders, prime ministers offering very generous deals and them being rejected. So my question is, should we be in the position, should we continue to offer these deals? Is that good diplomacy? Is that what Israel needs?
I would say, Moshe, absolutely not. I think that what we're seeing at the moment is a bit of a general misunderstanding of Hamas and its driving motivations and really everything around it. The world is coming to us and saying, well, you can make a deal about the hostages. And they say, well, look, on day 50, 51, 52, 53, you made a deal with the terrorists. You managed to release not a small amount of the hostages, and at the same time, you didn't have to stop the war. That was a fundamental misunderstanding to say what was relevant then was relevant now. What Hamas did at the time was it released the people, the hostages, who were certainly a weight around their neck. It was the elderly, it was the women, it was the children. These were the people that the world was unified in condemning Hamas, in comparing it to ISIS. And so they had an interest at the time to give up on some of those hostages as a means to alleviate their own or the pressure that they were under. What we're seeing now, on the other hand, is Hamas has understood the world's support for Israel is waning, and therefore we have these strategic assets which we are going to leverage to the hilt to make sure we get everything we can, including bringing Israel to its knees to the point where it has to admit defeat in the war that Hamas, Yahya Sinwar, will live to see another day, to kill another Jew or thousands of Jews as they've said that they're going to do. And it's that misunderstanding of what are the Palestinians, and here I'm jumping a little bit more from Hamas to the Palestinian leadership in general. What do they really want? Hamas's charter is very clear. We want to destroy Israel. The PLO charter is very clear. We want to destroy Israel. The PLO has its program of stages that's been really in effect since the 1970s. Take whatever you can, use it as a means to carry on the fight against Israel. That's what they did as part of the Oslo Accords. And that's really their goal until this day. When you look onto it and you see everybody pushing this idea of a two-state solution. So a few weeks ago, I had a conversation at the JCPA with Professor Alan Dershowitz, and he said the only two-state solution that President Biden at the moment is interested in is Michigan and Pennsylvania. It's nothing to do with Israel. It's nothing to do with the Palestinians. It's all about internal politics. And unfortunately, that would seem to be the case, because the decision, the positive decision, is to say, we are not interested in actually seeing the reality. We are not interested in seeing Hamas's genocidal rejectionism. We're not willing to see the PLO, moderate Mahmoud Abbas rejectionism over the time, rejecting offer after offer after. We saw the events in March this year, everyone tends to think that it's only Hamas that's operating as one of these proxies of the Iranians, whereas in reality, what happened in March was that Israel intercepted, as it did in 2001, 2002 with the Karin A, Israel intercepted a massive arms shipment from the Iranians, from the IRGC, to the Palestinian leadership in Judea and Samaria, to those so-called moderates that everyone is pushing that they should continue on in Judea and Samaria and also play a part in the future of the Gaza Strip. This isn't good for them. It isn't good for us. And it's that willing blindness to actually, I somewhat hesitate to say it, but it's almost a racist stance. It's almost saying, you Palestinians, you don't really mean what you say, because that would just be far too hideous to even believe. So clearly you're not even intelligent enough to come up with a clear plan. That type of a stance towards the Palestinians isn't something which is respectful. They are saying what they mean, and they mean what they say. They want to destroy Israel. They say that, and they actually mean it. And so we have to now draw the conclusions from that, rather than playing blindly into this idea of making offer after offer after offer. The sad reality is we don't have enough to offer them that will ever be enough until we say to them, you know what? As Mahmoud Abbas about a year and a half ago, he stood in the UN and said, you know what? The Palestinians are now willing to accept the 1947 petition plan. Well, thank you very much. It came 75 years too late, but it's a nice idea. And really, the only thing the Palestinians would accept now is for Israel to say, you know what? We're going to give up on this thing that we call the land of Israel, and we'll take the Ugandan option. Let's move to Uganda and make the Jewish state there. As ridiculous as that is, that's their position. And that's unfortunately the reality that we need to see.
Maurice, we only have a few minutes left, and I want to thank all of our viewers and supporters for tuning in. Tomorrow, we're going to have a rapid-fire question and answer session with Brigadier General Amir Avivi. So if anyone has any questions, it doesn't look like we're going to get to the general today. If anyone has any questions, please send them in to me, and we will try to get through as many tomorrow. Maurice, the last time you joined this briefing, you shared with us, we spoke about the Knesset passing the law to help the victims of terror. And I'm curious to know, have there been any lawsuits that have been filed since that law was passed?
Well, so what that law said, Moshe had said that if you are a victim of terror and the terrorist who caused the damage, whether it caused a death in of a loved one or caused any type of disability, you are going to get punitive damages in large numbers for Israeli standards. 5 million shekel, about $1.345 million if you suffered some type of disability, or 10 million shekel, say 3 million, 2.8, $3 million if you suffered a loss towards in favor of the estate of the victim murdered. The law was only meant to come into force on the 1st of June, so it isn't yet relevant. But, and this really is hot off the press, as I heard yesterday in a meeting with a member of the Knesset who was heavily involved in the legislative process as well. He said that he had been told that by one of my colleagues, I try to the best extent possible to help all of the lawyers who are representing victims of terrorism and generally moving forward on those subjects. And the news is like this. The judges running the trials of the existing trials already against the PLO-PA are already suggesting to the lawyers representing the PA, we suggest that you agree already now to the damage awards, and if not, we will wait with our cases until the 1st of June, and then we will act according to the law. The PLO is already being strong-armed by the courts, and that was exactly, there were two goals to that legislation. One was to provide substantial compensation to the victims. On the other hand, to try to the greatest extent possible to inflict financial repercussions on the PAPLO for its support of terrorism. And that's something which we're already seeing. And I hope that not only with new lawsuits, but already existing and standing lawsuits, we're also going to see that as a massive part of that progress moving forward.
Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hirsh, thank you so much for joining me today. I feel like we need to have you back on June 1st to talk about those floodgates hopefully opening up. Thank you to all of our viewers and supporters for tuning in. We will be back with you tomorrow, 10 a.m. Eastern Time, 5 p.m. here in Israel with General Avivi. Until then, stay safe, stay strong. Take care, everyone.
Bye.